Okay, I'm here with Jeff Carreira. Is that how you say your name?
That's right. Very good.
Awesome. And if you don't mind me monologuing for a second, I think it might be helpful to tell you how I happened upon your name. I was speaking, as I just was saying off air, to Jeff Kripal at Rice University, uh, who was a fascinating conversation. And I wrote down the quote because it might be complimentary, or at least I imagine it would help explain my interest in wanting to speak with you. He said it's as if we're looking at something projected onto a screen and everyone's saying, I can explain everything on the screen. And he says, well, of course you can, but there's a projector putting everything on that screen. What can you say or tell me? What can you say to me or tell me about the projector? And the answer is nothing. Um, at some point, I guess I said that reminds me of Plato's allegory of the cave. He said it is Plato's allegory of the cave. I'm like everybody else, chained to the floor, looking at shadows, but I recognize there's an outside. And at some point, I said, do you think anyone's been dragged out of the cave and actually started to see the light? And he said, oh, yeah, absolutely. And I said, who are those people and what are their emails? And he, of course, laughed. He said, I actually have their emails. And off air, he encouraged me to reach out to you. So I hope that doesn't put too much pressure on you.
I mean, it's enormously complimentary. So I'll just take it for what it is.
Wonderful. If you don't mind, I want to get to that introduction at some point. Can you introduce yourself and maybe what you do or what you say you do?
Sure.
Yeah.
I generally consider myself to be a meditation teacher and a mystical philosopher. I write a lot of books. That's one of the things that I do. I have a vision to share in written form all of the things that have inspired me and all of the perspectives and views and experiences I've had as a result of that inspiration. And I also teach, as I said, meditation and mystical philosophy. I've been teaching wholeheartedly um, since about 2007, I guess.
Hmm.
Uh, and I was teaching in various contexts before that. Uh, so it's been a long journey. I lived in a spiritual community for about 20 years.
Hmm.
I moved in 1992, and I was there until 2012. So uh, that was a very intensive incubator, and I started teaching within that context, and then after I left the community, was teaching on my own and have continued since then. So I run online programs. I have an online school. As I said, uh, I write books. I write essays, blog posts, and I lead retreats in various locations and do longer programs. And I just love it all.
Do you know how many books you've written? Because I took a look at your website and I thought I am just scrolling. It is an absurd amount of books.
Yeah, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 40.
If I had just looked at that list of books and didn't see you, and I knew, I think from an introductory video that I think it was around 39 years old. I think you referenced that number that you started a deeper spiritual pursuit or teaching or something.
Yeah, probably. 29 is when I moved into community.
Okay.
39 is probably, yeah, when I started teaching.
If I looked at if I had that number in my mind, 39, and then looked at the number of books you've written, I would have just thought before meeting you that you would be 1,000 years old.
No, I've been blessed with an ability to write quickly.
Mm,
Uh, so that's been a big help. And it's like Jeffrey Kripal that you mentioned. One of the things that he and I bond on is
mm,
that writing is a spiritual path for both of us. I
mm.
think we both see it as a spiritual practice, the process of emptying and uh, allowing the inspiration to just flow through you with uh, as freely as possible. At least that's how my process goes. And I really see it as he and I once had a wonderful conversation about how books can be like mystery schools themselves,
Mm.
where you can, if you have the ability to see what's really behind the words, you can enter into the mystery through the words.
Interesting. And I might be able to intuit what you meant, but what exactly do you mean by mystery school?
So, my online community, I call a mystery school, and that's
Hmm.
because I have been fascinated by the ancient mystery schools, particularly of Greece.
Hmm.
So, the great Greek thinkers, Pythagoras, Aristotle, they all had their schools, and they've often been thought of as mystery schools.
Yeah.
And they had teachings that they were inviting people to explore,
Hmm.
and practices. Uh, and that there were Egyptian mystery schools in ancient times. There's been Christian mystery schools. So the idea is that there is a mystery, mystical, hidden wisdom that people gather together around in order to facilitate deeper understanding of these invisible realms, you could say.
Interesting. So is this anything from Eleusis to the Gnostics
Yeah,
to
absolutely. I mean,
who's the Hermes Trismegistus? Is that it?
and that's absolutely,
Okay.
they all, there were just lots of various mystery schools, and some of it, of course, some of it is certainly factual and historical.
Hmm.
There's also, of course, probably myths that develop around,
Sure.
these various schools, and but I find it all very fascinating.
Yeah. As I I just re-listened to Jeff and I's conversation, and if, I'm going to kick myself if I'm misquoting him, but I think as he said, I don't believe your beliefs, but I believe belief.
Hmm.
I think that might speak to the sort of fictionalization of people's accounts, right?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. Do you um how much are you writing a day for 40 books? I mean, that's
It's a bit in spurts. It
mhm,
depends. But when I'm really into it, sometimes a book is just coming strong.
yeah.
So I I have been known to write um, a first draft of about, what turns out to be in the end 250 pages
Mm,
in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. Um,
yeah, that's impressive.
if it's really flowing,
Sure.
and of course, other times it's not flowing with that intensity, but I generally write every day for an hour or two at least, and then, as I said, when it's really flowing, I might write 5 6 hours in a day.
Hmm. I watched one introductory video of yours on your website, which is a very interesting website, I should note. And the video made me kick myself for having not watched a bunch of them.
Mhm.
And it was the video where you talk about having a secret as a kid, being maybe 3 or 4 years old and having a secret
Yes,
where you would look into the bathroom mirror. I want to get to that in a second, and I would love for you to recount parts of that. I'd be fascinated to know what the unscripted version of that is, because I imagine that you've revisited that time and time again throughout your life, I'm sure. Um, you weren't, I think you mentioned that you weren't either in that video or somewhere in the paragraphs around it. You weren't always a spiritual teacher. At some point, you were an engineer. Do I have that correct?
that is true. I was an engineer and I was a school teacher.
Wow. Okay. Well, great.
I taught a few different things, but I taught for a long time in a, a group home for
Hmm.
adjudicated teens, and
Wow.
I taught for 3 or 4 years as a middle school special needs teacher,
Hmm.
and I taught freshman algebra and physics more
Wow.
briefly.
And then what kind of engineering did you do?
I worked for an electro optic company. We made lasers, semiconductor laser diodes for computer systems.
And how many lives have you lived?
Yeah, exactly. No, I just 3 or 4, I think.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Which was the what were you doing before you became a full-time teacher in this sort of spiritual or mystery school sense?
For work, I was school teaching. So
Okay.
I went to college I studied physics as an undergraduate. I
Hmm.
became an engineer. I liked that for 5 or 6 years. The company I was working for started to at that point do a lot of military contracts.
Hmm.
And the armed services came to show us sort of what we were supporting with all of our technology.
Sure.
And I was slightly horrified that this is what I was doing with my time. So I moved out of engineering,
Hmm.
and, I had always loved teaching. So I thought I'd teach high school physics, but one thing led to another, and I got a special needs degree and started teaching special needs.
Is it too capital R romantic of me to imagine that your interest in physics has some tie-in to your interest in these
Mm,
deeper spiritual truths?
absolutely not, no romantic at all. I wanted to study physics because I was at that point, I had been raised Catholic.
Hmm.
I had rebelled against the church. I had become a staunch atheist materialist. And
Hmm.
I was convinced that if I understood physics, I would understand the true workings of the universe. And
Interesting.
I got disillusioned when I went far enough in physics to come across uh, string theory, which was really popular at the time. And, sometimes dubbed the theory that basically can't explain anything because it can be changed to explain anything. you know, it's,
Interesting.
it, it's,
Ah.
it's just so wild. And I thought, wow, this feels like people are just making this up, uh,
Hmm.
which is actually part of the art of physics, which I have later come to appreciate. But I read Thomas Kuhn's Structures of Scientific Revolutions, and I learned about scientific paradigms and, how science is not really about finding out the truth. It's about filling out a fundamental idea about reality, uh, until that idea changes. And then you throw all that out and start again. Uh, and that kind of really propelled me along on a path to want to understand myself rather than the outside world.
Interesting. You could tell me if I'm going down too narrow of an alley here, but that takeaway that you got from that book, the title of which I can't remember, um, and I'm obviously I'm remembering in this moment that you have a book called Paradigm Shifts or
Yeah, that's
Paradigm
right.
Shift,
Mm-hmm.
right? Jeff Kripal and I spent a little bit of time talking about what I might go back and reannotate the sort of science of religion or this like dogma of religion or this dogma of science. Um, sorry, the religion of science. The way that I was sort of talking about it with him was that science was really interested in sort of like expanding out what we know really, really slowly. And the way that I understood Jeff was saying, he's like, well, sometimes we experience things that are like way out here and we just haven't gotten there yet. And so people will term this the impossible. And of course, this is a word that he keeps coming back to. Was that your experience? That is that what you were saying, that they're interested in sort of filling in what they an idea, or were you saying that they're actually not interested in expanding at all?
Well, this is I'm going to just give you a brief story of how this came about. I
Sure.
was an engineer, and we had a piece of machinery called a reactive ion etcher, and it wasn't working properly. And this was a really big problem, costing us, you know, thousands upon thousands of dollars every day because it
Hmm.
kept depositing copper all over silicon chips, where that's really bad because the copper is highly conductive and it means everything shorts out.
Interesting.
And I worked for 2 or 3 months doing experiments to
Hmm.
figure out what was happening. And every day I'd report on my results. I was a junior engineer, and the senior engineers would then debate and come up with a new theory of what was happening and send me in to do a different experiment. And we did so, and the theories just got wilder and wilder,
Hmm.
about how atoms were breaking down and recombining and forming copper. After 2 or 3 months, I was just so fed up. I needed a break. So I spent a few days cleaning the machine, and I decided to like really do a good job so that I could milk it out.
Hmm.
And I pulled the whole thing apart. And deep in the machine, I found a penny that someone had dropped. And that was actually the source of all the copper. And that something popped. I was reading Structures of Scientific Revolutions at the time. And basically what that book is saying is that normal science is basically people very methodically hunting down evidence to support what we already believe is true.
Hmm.
and extending what we already believe is true into domains that hasn't reached yet.
Hmm.
And that's really valuable, and it leads to all kinds of great results. But he talked about how there's also revolutionary science, and revolutionary science occurs when either our current theory, there's something's happening that we can't possibly explain,
Hmm.
and somebody just decides to make up a completely different way of seeing, or someone just has an inspiration, like Einstein, has some wild idea about relativity that has nothing to do with classical mechanics, and he just sticks with it until everybody sees, oh, it's actually true.
Hmm.
Or it's some kind of like, in that case, it's almost a mystical revelation. And at that point, that's what I don't know if I remember which physicist it was who said, I think it was Max Planck, but I could be wrong. But he basically said new scientific theories are accepted from one generation to the next because the current generation has to die off before
Sure.
the next generation will accept it. And that
Hmm.
was a bit of what this book, The Structures of Scientific Revolutions, was about. It was about how we get embedded in unconscious beliefs about the way things are. Those beliefs shape what we see so that everything we see seems to conform to what we already believe. And then we think because we're seeing things that conform to what we believe, that must be proof that it's true.
Right.
And there are times when you just burst out
Hmm.
of the current paradigm and you realize, wow, we don't really know what's true. We actually really don't know what's true.
Do you think that should be the scientific disposition? I'm going to, at some point, to make a parallel to like a sort of meditative disposition, right?
Yeah. And I would say this, a true scientific disposition is that. And a true scientists understand that all theories are theories. This is why no theories are ever proven in science, right?
Hmm.
They're always tested over and over again because we just don't know. We keep testing. There's a difference between, and this is probably what you and Jeff were talking about. There's a difference between science, which is this very open-ended, ongoing investigation in which nothing is ever seen as a final truth because everything can be overturned,
Hmm.
and what's called scientism,
Hmm.
which is more like the religion of science, which is often the way science is viewed, especially in the more in the view of the general public, which is that science isn't seen as a way of exploring reality ongoingly. It's seen as a collection of facts about reality. And that's not what science is. It's not a collection of facts. It's a collection of theories that are the best theories we have so far.
How much of that do you think is the result of people saying, "Great, I trust you, white lab coat and all. What do I do?"
Absolutely. I mean,
Hmm.
it's a huge, it's like, in the Middle Ages, it was the church,
Sure.
in the modern world, it's science. But
Hmm.
the reality is we don't all have time to figure out what's true for ourselves. So we do have to trust something. It's just, it can go too far and
Interesting.
we can get complacent and we can begin to think that somebody actually knows when in the end, nobody actually knows.
Yeah. I will at some point. I want to come back to this question of the scientific disposition and how it
Mm-hmm.
might have analogs to a meditative disposition. But um, I'd like to introduce that by revisiting the story of you in the mirror.
Yeah.
You said in the video that you realized that you had a secret at some point that you unlearned.
Mm-hmm.
What was that, or that you forgot? What was that secret?
Okay. Well, let me tell you the story.
Sure.
So this is me 10 years into living in community on a spiritual retreat
Hmm.
at about the age of 39, sitting in meditation. Uh, this was a 2 month long retreat, and this was about halfway through it or something. And I was very motivated. So I was really giving a lot of my energy to the practice. And at some point, I was sitting. I was in those at that time. I was sitting with eyes open, and suddenly I saw that I was moving to like my line of sight was moving upward toward the ceiling.
Hmm.
And I thought, wow,
Oh, you're just,
Yeah, it was like, wow, I'm like floating up.
yeah, yeah.
And then I floated through the roof,
Hmm.
like my line of sight, and I saw, like the rafters, and then I was outside, and then I kept going, and to make a long story short, it was this long journey that ended up with me the size of the entire universe.
Hmm.
And I had this feeling that I'm home,
Hmm.
that I am the universe, and I've returned, and I felt this enormous swelling of just deep comfort and
Hmm.
love. And then I shrunk back down until I went back into the room and I was back on my cushion.
And you're like,
And
no.
exactly. But when I got back, I thought, I used to do this all the time when I was like 3. And I suddenly had this vivid memory of how I used to go into the bathroom. And my secret was I could go in the bathroom, lock the door, stare into my own eyes in the mirror,
Hmm.
and blow up to be the size of the universe, experience this elation of love and joy and homecoming, and return to my body,
Right.
unlock the door, and leave.
Flush the toilet. Yeah.
Right. And I never told anybody about it. But anytime like life felt like it was too much, I
Interesting.
just go and blow up to the size of the universe. And I remembered after this retreat experience, I remembered very vividly the day I couldn't do it anymore.
Hmm.
The day that I looked into my eyes and I had forgotten how. And for a while I kept trying to figure out how in different ways.
Yeah.
And eventually I just forgot that I ever could.
Hmm.
But I still had this interest in wanting to see through my mind. I had it all through high school. I had it all through college, but I forgot the
Hmm.
reason why. It was just this unconscious curiosity and philosophy and meditation and spiritual things that I always, even as a devout materialist atheist, I still had this interest in the paranormal and the mystical.
How much of it, I mean, I'm sure you thought a lot about this, but how much of it do you think had to do with actually looking into your own eyes?
I think that was because I wasn't doing that on the retreat when I was
Right.
39. So evidently uh that was something I had discovered. That was the secret, that if I looked into my own eyes, it would happen. Now, I don't think I don't think that would necessarily work for everyone. And I I think there can be a lot of triggers, so we certain practices can trigger us to let go, to lose the sense of limitation, to lose the sense of constraint, that we just get so focused. In my case, it was staring into my own eyes, but I think it could be a lot of things that would allow one to let go in that way.
Yeah. It's such a fascinating story because I imagine as a 4 year old, you have so little self consciousness.
Right.
And I don't know if this is a strange paradox, but then you look into your eyes and you're really just deeply contemplating yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly you have this profound experience, right? And it sounds like you had it multiple times as a kid. But then I wonder if you get older, I don't know what age, 6, 7, 8, you're like, what does my hair look like? Like you're looking in the mirrors and you're seeing different things. You're like, oh, my teacher upset me yesterday. There's that person in class I like, whatever, right? You're thinking about different things. You look in the
Mm-hmm.
mirror, and then suddenly 30 plus years later, you're 39 and you're not using a mirror, but you're deeply looking into yourself again and you have that experience again.
Absolutely. It's I think there was a great book written many years ago called The Spiritual Life of Children, I think.
Hmm.
I have it somewhere, but I haven't picked it up for years. But it was all about, if you interview young children, often they have experiences that you could only think of as spiritual experiences. They see things, they hear things.
Yeah.
But yeah, what happens is, as we get older, we solidify into a sense
Hmm.
of self, and we also learn to conform to the agreed upon limits of reality. Uh, and we just this is the analogy I often use with people. I say, imagine you saw an alien sitting up in a tree, a ways away, and
Yes.
you looked at the person next to you. You said, "Oh my God, you see that alien in the tree?" And they looked and they said, "I don't see that."
Hmm.
And they look at you like, what the hell's wrong with you? And you
Right.
go, okay. And then you go to the next person. Look at that. And they don't see it.
Hmm.
You know, how many people would have to say, I don't see it before you'd stop asking?
Not many.
Right. And how many people would have to say, I don't see it before you'd stop seeing it?
Hmm.
You know, and I think that's what happens to all of us. We get conditioned by consensus reality to only seeing what the current paradigm will allow you to see.
Interesting.
Why? Because we're all deeply motivated not to be ostracized, not to be, you know, removed from the tribe. You know,
Hmm.
it's a deep, deep drive in us to want to belong. Uh, and uh, yeah, and so it's in the end, we're afraid to stick out too far.
What do you do then with histories of shamanic traditions where you have that outsider is really valued, and maybe we all don't see the alien that they see in the tree, but we really value them?
Right. Because we live because in that culture, there's a paradigm where part of the agreed upon reality is that there are aliens in trees and some people can see them.
Mm.
And so if someone says, I'm seeing the alien in a tree, you don't look at them and say, oh my God, what's wrong with this person? You go, wow, this is a shaman.
Mm.
This person's he's got the gift or she's got the gift.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a culture in which the mysteries of the invisible realms and the unknown were accepted as a part of reality, where in our current, in the modern, highly materialistic worldview, anything that can't be, you know, proven with collective sensual evidence is held as suspect and merely subjective, which means not really true.
Sure. Interesting. I'm thinking, and you spoke to a what I interpreted as a cultural Roman Catholic upbringing. That almost feels like it's starting to feign that shamanic paradigm where, hey, there are people who see things differently, but it almost feels a little excusing, where it's like, yeah, I don't know if growing up as a cultural Catholic, I really trusted that the priest really saw things or had connections to things I didn't think. Occasionally I'd stumble into a really wise priest and I would just be struck by their wisdom or their
Mhm.
perspective, but I wouldn't think that they were, you know, sort of on a different frequency.
Yeah, and I think that describes my experience. I wanted to be a priest
Hmm.
uh, when I was a kid. In
Hmm.
fact, till about the age of 4 or 5, when I confided in my grandfather that
Hmm.
I wanted to be a priest, and he said, "Oh, that's a great idea. They make a lot of money." And I thought, "Oh, that's not what I want to be a priest." I thought, and I just decided, okay, that's not what I want anymore. Um, but we have to realize that even being raised Catholic in the modern world, we are fundamentally secular Catholics,
Hmm.
which means, yeah, we can believe, but believing in a modern context is different than believing in a traditional or sort of medieval context. Uh,
What do you mean by that?
it means that um, in the modern world, you're kind of having to straddle two things, right? You're having to straddle the kind of scientific materialist worldview, which is by far the dominant influence
Hmm.
over modern life, and um, and then if you are a believer, you have to sort of tenaciously hold on to that and find a way to make it work in this larger
Hmm.
context. And if you go very far in that direction, you'll end up separating out. You'll become part of a smaller sect or a group that's more separated, and someone who lived in a spiritual community that was, for all intents and purposes, a cult.
Hmm.
Uh, you can see what you have. Your worldview is so different than the secular worldview that you need to kind of completely isolate yourself in order to feel comfortable with what it is that you believe. And even in that context, you're constantly having to bump up, I was at least constantly having to bump up against the spiritual realities that I believed in and that I was experiencing, and the more secular, scientific, materialist background I had in physics that were often at direct odds. And I kind of believed both and
Mm.
somehow had to make it all work for myself.
Does that, I mean, how does that struggle not persist? Because it's not like it sounded like you still remember all the physics.
Yeah. Well, I guess,
You might not remember all the equations.
no, I definitely don't remember all of it. And I think a lot's changed since I've been studying it. But if I speak for myself, I think, gradually and maybe in spurts, I came more and more to the point where my my spiritual life and my spiritual beliefs were so much more important to me,
Mm.
and in which I had created a life around those beliefs to such a degree that they became increasingly dominant in terms of what was influencing me. And I think also, naturally, as you get older, you are more and more willing to stand out,
Mm.
and I live a very how do I want to say this? Most of the time, the people I interact with are in the same kind of spiritual view that I am.
Mm.
Uh, so I had much more, it was more challenging for me during the years that I was living in a spiritual community and working in a school system. Uh,
Sure.
because then I was having to navigate much more the secular world and the spiritual world, as my life has been more consumed by my teaching and my writing, and the people that have gathered that are interested in that, and my peers who are doing similar things. I'm less and less at conflict and more feel free to live in a belief system that's often directly contradictory to the dominant way of seeing things.
Interesting. So you're 3 or 4 years old. You realize you have a secret. That secret slowly fades. Um, you realize that you can't access it. And at some point, did you have any interest in returning to that, or it wasn't until you accidentally returned to that at 39 that you
Well,
realized that you had that the whole time
I
potentially?
mean, to me, that experience I had at 39 helped me understand my whole life,
Mm.
right? Because from what I remembered of my life, I always had this weird interest in things like locking myself in my father's car and trying to stop my mind,
Mm.
laying out on the lawn on summer evenings and looking up at the stars until my spine started to shake
Mm.
with this kind of weird feeling of the immensity of the universe.
Mm.
Uh, you know, doing LSD in
Sure.
college, and I'm being amazed at how my mind, like,
Mm.
I didn't know what was real because I didn't know how much of my reality was actually just being created with my mind, because the whole thing could be altered with a pill.
Mm.
And then uh, after, then eventually getting interested in meditation and cognitive psychology, and then deeper mystical philosophies. And then at the age of 29, when I was married and I was a school teacher and I owned a white house with a white picket fence, and I banged into this spiritual community, and I watched myself leave everything to go move in with a whole group of strangers that I didn't know
Mm.
on a quest for enlightenment, which never made any sense to my mind. But when I had this experience 10 years after that, I thought, oh, that's why.
Mm.
Like, somewhere unconsciously, I was deeply haunted
Mm.
by those early memories. And even though I didn't have a conscious memory of them, they were driving a lot of my behavior and choices, and especially these big moments like leaving my career and my wife and my white house and joining a spiritual community, which everybody except me, well, everybody kind of including me, thought was insane, to be
Sure.
honest.
Wow. I don't know if I'm going to force this, but earlier we were talking about this sort of scientific, methodical approach to proving what you sort of already know. That seems weirdly analogous to your spiritual pursuit where you sort of already knew something in maybe like a gnostic sense, or like you sort of knew that you already had been there as a child, right, to this place. um and it sounds like you started very methodically trying to get back to that secret, or to that realization.
Absolutely. Largely unconsciously, but
Mm,
definitely. And you know, the thing that I want to say about that at this moment is I'm not a big believer in truth,
mm.
period. Uh, I think, I don't know what the truth is, but I think that this event that we call reality is a co created event, which means I do believe there is something real, you know, and that something real is constantly interacting with my perceptions and my beliefs and my ideas and my choices, and somehow in that mix of my engagement with things and the real things I'm engaged with, whatever they are, what emerges is an experience that I call reality. And you know, I could look at my spiritual path and I could say, okay, I discovered something that was true, and I methodically, you know, made discoveries and found out how true it was. But I don't know if that's what happened. You know, I think what happened is I discovered a possibility, a potential that I had experienced as a child, and then I made choices and lived a life that made that possibility more and more available to me
Hmm.
as a person. So is that reality? Well, it's my reality. You know, is it somebody else's reality? Not necessarily. And, you know, I just don't, I'm very, I'm very enamored with the way in which what we experience as real has much more to do with our own choices than we might think.
What we experience is real has more to do with our own choices than we might think. Can you give me another example besides your whole life story? Sorry.
Well, maybe to make that clearer, you know, it's the whole idea of a paradigm, right? So this got me started
Hmm.
on this track. So what Thomas Kuhn, he was a professor at Princeton University. He was a historian of science,
Hmm.
and he said, okay, so the story of science, what we learn is that the story of science is here we are in a big world, and science is discovering facts about the world. And he said, you know, largely that's what science does. It keeps going, oh, you know, the force equals mass times acceleration works here, and it works over there, and it works in the stars, and we're expanding where it works and seeing it works everywhere.
Hmm.
But you know, sometimes, every now and again, through the so-called history of science,
Yeah.
something happens that's so dramatic, right, that suddenly everything gets called into question. And he goes through various um, examples of that. And he said the later history books of science will always talk about how this was an advancement based on the discovery of something that was more true, that led to even more truth in science. But he said, if you actually look at science before the revolution and science after, there's no relationship between those.
Hmm.
It's like everybody lived in one world, and then everybody lived in a different world.
Hmm.
You know, he has a great quote in his book, and it's something like, um, after a paradigm shift, the world doesn't change, but everything is different.
Yeah.
You know, and I started to see, yeah, we as scientists work our way into a reality which allows us or demands from us that we keep over months making up wilder and wilder theories about what might be happening in an etcher without anyone ever thinking maybe we should clean it.
Right.
You know, we were just in a reality that didn't allow for that possibility. And, you know, it wasn't like I was smarter than anybody else. I was just having to do all these experiments and I was tired of it. So it was really an accident. But I saw in that example, it changed me. I saw how we were all in a view of reality that kept spitting out theories to test, and it probably would have spit them out indefinitely. You know, because if you've got really smart people in a room, they can create a lot of theories.
And so on the other side, then the sort of spiritual and mystical pursuit would almost be similar, where you have this methodical approach, but not in pursuit of a theory.
uh I think it's probably also, you know, consciously or unconsciously in pursuit of a theory.
Hmm.
I am very enamored. I like that word. So I'm very enamored. I'm in love with mystical philosophy, mystical experience. And what I find is as I study more mystical ideas, as I do more mystical practices, this has always been the case. I gain access to more non ordinary experiences of reality. And those inform how I live in ways that give me the most fascinating life to live.
Hmm.
So when people ask me, you know, why do I teach? Because I'm so compelled to keep writing and teaching. Why do I do this? It's not because I think I know the truth and I want you to know the truth. It's because I'm having a great time being a human being and I want you to have a great time being a human being. And I don't know if you're going to have a great time the way I am, but if you are that kind of person, let's do it together.
Hmm. Again, I'm really fascinated by this dichotomy between this sort of scientific exploration towards truth, and then it sounds like in your experience, the only thing you've arrived at is that there is no truth, right?
Well, it's not that there is no truth. I actually think there is a truth.
Hmm.
What I think is that we'll never know what it is.
Okay.
You know,
Interesting.
and so something's true, whatever that means. But
Hmm.
you know, I've definitely come to the conclusion I'm never going to know what it is in some way that I can say, hey, this is the truth.
Sure.
Um, I'm a kind of a pragmatist in some ways, which is, you know, I know what's working for me in terms of the opening of my experience to mystical realms that I find the most compelling thing about being human. You know,
Hmm.
the most compelling thing to me about being human is that we can keep exploring beyond the edges of the material universe into these spiritual, mystical, esoteric realms of of what is. And that, you know, it's kind of like once I realized that this whole three-dimensional universe that we live in is itself, you know, kind of a thin facade that separates us from a whole infinite vastness beyond.
Hmm.
I just want to go out there. You know, I want to see what's out there.
Yeah.
I I'm not as interested in the confines of 3D life.
Hmm. Excuse me if I'm not interpreting this exactly correctly, but your, at least from my perception, your aversion to the word truth, insofar as it's not particularly helpful because we will never know what it is. Do you have a similar aversion to a word like God?
Mm, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, because God is another word that means truth, but in a so I love the word God for, you know, I love words
Sure.
and uh I love the word God. I tend to use the word the divine
Hmm.
over God, but I love the word that just means the totality of isness, you
Sure.
know, which is a kind of completely undefinable something.
Yeah.
Uh and you know the the challenge with truth is that anyone who has a very strong sense that they know the truth runs the risk of a kind of absolutist fanaticism.
Hmm.
And that can be in a spiritual context, a scientific context, a political context. But, anytime we know the truth and other people don't know the truth, that gives us license for all kinds of unsavory behaviors,
Sure.
that have not proven to be particularly useful in any context.
Right. Cautionary tales abound.
Exactly. The additional challenge in the spiritual domain with a word like God, which I said is kind of a substitute for truth,
Hmm.
is you're giving the goal of mystical traditions is to come into direct contact with the unknowable. And anytime you give a word to the unknowable, even the unknowable,
Hmm.
it tends to reify it into a something.
Hmm.
And I think you said it earlier, right? About you can't see the projector,
Right.
right? So the awareness, the source of awareness, which you can take a moment and just become aware of awareness
Yeah.
and just
Trippy.
see that you're just flowing, you know.
Hmm.
But as soon as you give that a name and call it anything, it your mind is going to tend to create an idea of something around it that will ultimately limit your access to it.
Hmm.
Because the only way to gain access to the unknowable is to not know.
And I'm sorry for the people who are listening because I'm going to use my hands and I'm going to probably over depend on my hands in a second. But is it constraining when we name it or label it or whatever, call it even? Because is it constraining to our experience because we think it might be in here where it could be out here, but when we give it a label, we think it's confined to that space?
Absolutely. That's one way to think about it, and it's absolutely true. The other way to think about it is it's constraining because generally speaking, we're all lazy,
Sure.
right? And so what that means is if I know it and I have a label for it, I can put it in a box and go, hey, did that. Now I can move on. But the whatever God is, whatever the mystery is, it's not something you move on from.
Hmm.
That's something you go, oh shit, whoa. And then you just stay there. That's
Yeah.
you don't say, oh, that was God. Great.
Right.
Write it in my journal, put it in my drawer.
Yeah.
Now I can forget about it.
Check.
Check, did it. God realization
Yeah.
done.
Doesn't lend itself to efficiency. I had this bizarre experience, and I've cited this a few times because I think in some ways, um, I seem to mostly interview religious scholars, and you're interestingly on the practitioner side of that. Um, but I tend to interview religious scholars and ed reformists.
Mhm.
Um, and so this comes up quite a bit, at least with the religious scholars. I had the experience and the opportunity to sit down very organically with uh, two gentlemen, both in their late 70s or early 80s. One was a Sufi monk,
Mm.
and the other was what I probably later learned would be a Kabbalistic Jew or
Mhm.
a mystical Jewish man. And the Jewish guy blew my mind and asked me a question. If it were a test, I to the degree that it was a test, I absolutely failed it. But he asked me because he knew that I was sort of interested in religions and comparative religions and mythologies. He sort of said, Kevin, if someone came to you and they really eagerly wanted to experience God, what would you tell them to do? And I won't even waste your time with my answer because it was that bad. But I have loved asking people this question. And you should know again that I failed miserably.
Okay.
So to the degree it might be an intimidating question, but I essentially gave an intellectual answer about comparative and religions and sort of said, well, you need to ask that person what kind of God they want to think about. And he was like, okay, well, what if they read all those books? Then what? Um, And at one point I got frustrated and I sort of answered back to him, well, what would you recommend? And his answer blew me away. And it seems to be in line with your practice. And he said, he said, I would tell them if I met them only one time to sit in a room for as long as they can and to try to strip themselves of all of their conscriptions and um, identities and their attachments.
Right.
And eventually, whatever they find at the bottom of that, that's about the closest thing that we
Mm-hmm.
could call God.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah, it was a really profound answer. But are you interested when you teach people meditation in getting them to experience God? Because you're
I
essentially
am,
teaching people to do what he recommended.
yes, I am interested in, I'm interested in getting people to experience the source of reality.
Mm.
And I think that's the language I would want to use. And so if I were to answer the question that the rabbi posed to you, I would say just look meticulously at every aspect of your experience in the exact instant of the arising moment until the magnificence of being just overwhelms you.
Mm.
That if you get involved in stuff, right? In your story about things, your ideas about yourself, your ideas about it. If you get involved in all the stories and all the ideas, you just live in the world of ideas. But as the rabbi said, if you step out of all those stories and you just get very, very, very quiet
Mm.
so that you can see the emerging instant of reality, right? There's only one now, and this is it. And if you can really just put all of your attention on this exact instant, the eternal now, that there is no other, there is no second moment.
Mm.
There's just this ever present now. And you leave your attention on that, eventually it will dawn on you that this is a miracle, that there is just an unfolding explosion of being that never ends. And that's what the true now is. And that's, as far as I know, that's as close to God as you can get.
And as a friend of mine who I interviewed a while back said to me once, and on the third hand,
Mhm.
you're really interested in these sort of aberrant mystical practices that seem geared in some capacity at getting you to focus on that,
Yes.
right? Um, what are some of those practices that have recently fascinated you, or I'm sure you're always learning about them? Are there
Mm.
any that have recently really excited you or interested you?
Absolutely. So the basic idea is, if any one of us was at a point where we could just sit down and surrender, kind of what the
Sure.
rabbi said,
Right,
you wouldn't
right.
need any practice. You're done. You
Right.
just let go, and then so it's over, right?
Mm.
But most of us need a lot of practices. So um, the main practice that I often teach is, I call it the art of conscious contentment. It's just the ability to sit and not make a problem out of anything that happens, right? So you can just relax.
Yeah.
The power of being able to truly relax is phenomenal. And,
Conscious contentment.
and once you can really sit and not make a problem out of anything and relax,
Mm.
then the next kind of step on the journey is you want to forget yourself completely.
Mm.
You want to let go so much that you forget, like if you're in meditation, you forget you're meditating, you forget you're sitting, you just blink out. And you ask, what practices am I excited about now? I am very excited now about what can begin to happen once you blink out.
Mm.
Once you let go of attention to the ordinary world, once your attention is liberated from that, once you're no longer paying attention to that, where does your attention go then? That's the more interesting question.
Mm.
What happens when you stop paying attention to the ordinary? And uh, how can you journey beyond the ordinary into the extraordinary. I think there are ways to do that. Various mystical traditions have written about it. Uh, it's a very tricky maneuver because you have to do it and not do it at the same time.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very weird thing, but it's literally described in just about every mystical tradition in some way or another. And I have experienced that. I'm
Hmm.
fascinated by it.
I would imagine
And
experiencing
it
it would fascinate me.
absolutely. And you feel
Right.
like, well, then you're filling out your sense of self.
Hmm.
And it seems to be that as you fill out, as you experience these other dimensions of being, your ability to surrender increases. Exactly how there's a relationship there, I don't really know, but that's what my experience tells me, that it somehow you become more at home in a bigger universe, and being more at home in a bigger universe allows you to relax more deeply,
Hmm.
and let go more, which then creates the space to explore more, and then you feel even more at home, and
Hmm.
then you're able to relax more, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. What's at the bottom of that almost scares me.
Yeah, well, it's probably not a bad thing to be scared of, I
Yeah.
suppose. But the thing is, to the part of us that's very um, identified with and loyal to this separate sense of self that maneuvers through the ordinary world, letting go to that degree is terrifying.
Hmm.
Uh, to the part of us that is already expanded into all dimensions, it's already there anyway. There's
Hmm.
no fear. So a big part of the spiritual journey, which is what you were talking about a minute ago, is our identity shifts from what's often talked about as the small self or the
Hmm.
separate self to the big self, which is the whatever that is, the God self. And when your identity shifts to that side,
Hmm.
it's not none of this is scary anymore. It's all already happened from that point of view.
Yeah. This a very random Joseph Campbell lecture is coming to mind where he's talking about Buddhism and I think he's talking to a bunch of prep students and he's talking about this sort of Brahman idea and this the Buddha consciousness being in all things. And he sort of says, when I look up at the ceiling, I see individual lights, but they're carrying light. And if
Right.
one bulb breaks, I'm not like, oh, we really missed that light. He's like, you just put in another light. He's like, when I look down at you, I don't see lights, I see heads. And in those heads is consciousness. Right. And I think in the same lecture, he talks about sort of you exactly as you just said, sort of I going from this transference of identity in the small self to this larger self. You're not as attached to the vehicle. You're more interested in the what that vehicle is carrying.
Absolutely. And it's uh I once wanted to make a kid show, um, which I probably never will. But anyway, it was going to be called Radio Land,
Hmm.
and it was going to be about all these different radios, and then one breaks, and the music's not coming out, and everybody's really upset, but nobody realizes that it's all the same music.
Huh.
The music didn't go anywhere. Like that one radio is broken, but the music is still playing in all the radios,
Hmm.
and it's still emanating from the source, which is the station, from which it comes. So one radio may break, another one may work, but the music continues. And you feel more like, oh yeah, the consciousness continues.
Yeah, I can almost picture the pages of that children's book. That's
Yeah,
great.
exactly.
Yeah, that's,
I
yeah,
don't know how popular it would be, but it could be fun to write.
yeah, yeah, yeah. My imagination's sort of running away with me. That's a great story. Hmm. Um. Okay, I have a million questions. How are you on time?
I'm good.
I
Yeah,
think
we can
I
go a
I
bit
think I
longer.
told you about 50. Are you good with about 15 more minutes?
Yeah, let's do 15 more.
Okay. Um, what was the first Greek mystery school that you became really interested in? And have you read that Brian Marescu? The Immortality Key.
No, I have not read that.
Oh,
Sounds like I
really?
should though.
Yeah. Jeff Kripal, if you don't trust me, which you have every right not to, Jeff Kripal, I think we bonded on that book. The Immortality Key by Brian Muraresku is essentially an archaeobiological, um, yeah, archaeobiological pursuit of confirming the hypothesis that Eleusis would have been using some psychedelic mixture.
Mm, mm,
And I don't think there was a smoking gun, but they did find that one, the Eleusinian, if I'm saying that correctly, mystery spread, and they have, I think they do have smoking guns of it spreading and sort of popping up, going underground and popping up in places it shouldn't belong, like Spain and all these
mm,
Greek these little cups. And at the bottom of one of those cups, they found, uh, I believe, something like ergot or whatever the foundational molecule of LSD is.
mm.
So, and then he towards the end of the book, he starts talking about this, what sometimes might be referred to as this pagan continuity theory, which is that as Paul is sort of headed east and bumping into Greece, letter to Corinthians, etc., he's bumping into these mysteries, and that might have had an influence on early Christian traditions and early Christian mysteries.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to check that out. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, and he
Um,
he was a lawyer, and just this was his passion project for about 12 years. He was a
mm,
Latin and Greek and Sanskrit major in college, and I think at some point he defended someone who wanted medical marijuana, an NFL player or something, starts doing research on different illegal substances being used for therapy,
mm.
sees these psilocybin trials coming out of Johns Hopkins and says, "Oh my God, this reminds me of Eleusis." And then for 12 years goes down this rabbit hole and then comes out with this
Fascinating.
book. Yeah, it's really cool.
That is fascinating.
He's on plenty of podcasts, so you seem
And
like
this
a
is
busy
the
person if you don't want to read.
immortality key.
The Immortality Key.
Good. I'm going to remember that.
Yeah, I think it's called the secret history of the religion with no name, I think is the subtitle.
Okay. I will definitely check that
Yeah.
out.
So what
Well, I
Greek
think for
mystery cults were
me,
you interested in?
um,
I'll drop
I
the
was
word
very
cult, sorry.
interested in Christian tradition
Okay.
uh, in my youth. I was interested in the Gnostics
Mm,
and those mystery schools and the the secret teachings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the
mm,
whole idea that there were these groups of people studying things. So there was that. And one book that was very influential on me was a book called Reality by Peter Kingsley. And
mm,
to be honest, I can't remember if it was Plotinus or Pythagoras that he was writing about. But what I read in that I found fascinating was how they would incubate, which basically meant they would put you in a cave and seal it up.
mm,
And you would stay there for 3 days. And the idea is that you would visit the underworld and then come back
mm.
with visions and wisdom, right? And I just, as I read Peter Kingsley's book, I that was an image that just captivated me, that because I thought my spiritual practices are variations of that, you know,
Sure.
going into the underworld and coming back with
Mm,
wisdom, with uh, experiences to share. Um, I was doing it in meditation. I wasn't sealed into a cave, but uh, similar. And so I was really, really fascinated by all that. And then some years after I read it, I went and did a sensory deprivation float.
mm.
And the people who owned it, there were like 3 or 4 guys that owned this flotation tank, and they were all into the book Reality by Peter Kingsley because they saw
Huh.
their float tanks as the modern day version of sealing yourself into a cave. I haven't done that many floats, but I've had very powerful experiences
Hmm.
uh, in that kind of sensory deprivation
Yeah.
environment.
Interesting. I've never done one, but I've heard they're way more common now than I would have thought.
Yeah, they're all over the place.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's interesting. And so it's just an intense meditation.
Yeah, well, for me, yeah, it's intense meditation. It's also, well, I was saying, relaxation is so important,
Mm,
and you're in this tank, the one I was in, the ones I've been in at least are like, there's a lot of room for you to spread out. So you don't have to, you don't hit any sides.
Mm.
And it's very buoyant water, very, very salty, so that you float very high.
Mm.
And it, just kind of like you couldn't be more perfectly comfortable. It's like, it would be that or zero G, you could probably get a similar or maybe even a better experience if you were in outer space. But short of that, you're literally just floating
Mm.
on this water and it's pitch black dark. And yeah, I was kind of meditating and, eventually you're just gone.
Mm.
You're like your eye, you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed really. And this is what gets powerful in meditation. But this environment does it too, which is you lose reference points.
Mm.
In meditation, this can happen if you get very, very relaxed and you let go. You lose all reference points. This is how you forget yourself.
Mm.
You kind of forget that you're sitting. You forget which way is up. You forget how long you've been sitting. It's just there's nothing locating you anymore in any
Mm.
particular place. And the feeling is it's like you're just spreading out
Mm.
because all of that apparatus that's always pinning you down
Mm.
isn't functioning anymore.
I'm painfully aware that I keep using the sentence stem, how much of that is.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm imagining closing my eyes and having this instinct of wanting to reach out. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how much of your body is sort of instinctively trying to expand to get a reference point.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And also you can watch your mind trying to figure out,
Mm.
but at some point you just realize you can't, you get to this place where, at least I did, you can't really feel your body anymore. You
Right.
don't know if your arms are out or if they're in.
Mm.
And sometimes you can't withstand the uh the unknowing. And so like I remember like slapping my hand against the water so that I could get a sense of where it was.
Yeah.
Totally not where I thought it was. Like, I was sure it was like my arm was up here.
Yeah.
And then I slapped the water and found out I was right next to my leg. And it's like it's such a trip because
Yeah.
you realize, oh, I always think my sense of my body is me feeling me feeling my body. But
Mm.
in this tank, you realize, no, my sense of my body is the concocted experience of having a body that my mind is generating. And
Mm.
when my mind loses track of where my body is, it just creates a different experience of body that may or may not actually conform to the physical body.
Hmm.
See, this is the kind of stuff I get off on all the time.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like I know someone who swears by them, and I think I owe him a call now.
Oh yeah, you should. You should check it out, see what he's into.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done him a few times. I'm looking forward to doing them again.
Yeah.
But it never became my main practice. Of course, COVID didn't help.
Sure.
That kind of, the flotation tanks became a definite
Mm.
non-starter for I guess a couple of years.
Interesting. So how much you have like a very playful sense about you. I am, and you don't seem like, I just imagine if I were to talk to somebody who would have your description online, that you would be very regimented. I mean, how much of your practice is just sort of playful? Like I wanted to ask about fasting or different conditions, but I'm sure you've explored them rigorously, but do you subscribe to those practices in a really regimented way, or do you find yourself just more enthusiastically trying different things?
Yeah, mostly I'm enthusiastically trying different things.
Mm.
I do meditate regularly,
Sure.
uh, partly because I love it.
Yeah.
It's like my great chance to relax at
Mm.
least once a day. I did very, very disciplined practice for 2 decades,
Mm.
incredibly disciplined practice. There's a whole other story we could have
Sure.
around the practices I was engaged in community. And I think discipline is really important. Not uh it's in I think, and this isn't true for everyone, but I think for many of us, it is certainly true for me, learning how to be disciplined right? And discipline is such a great word. You know, it's got a bad rep because we think of it as like punishing children, you know, but
Sure.
you know, the true meaning of discipline, and of course discipline comes from the same root as disciple.
Mm,
Uh, but you know, discipline really had to do with what it took to make a horse rideable,
mm,
right? So an undisciplined horse was wild; it couldn't be ridden.
mm,
And so if you think about your identity, your sense of self in the same way, you need to make it rideable.
mm.
A sense of self is a wonderful thing to have. It's so useful. It's incredibly useful in the world, in earning money, and in spiritual practice. It's
Mm,
really important to have a sense of self. It's just not what you want to be controlling your life.
mm.
You know, so you want the sense of self to be something you can ride. and
Interesting.
and so a certain amount of discipline is important, you know, just so the sense of self learns its place. You know, it's not in control.
Mm,
You're not living for it, it's living for you.
mm.
You know, it's your sense of self, and it doesn't realize that. It thinks it's in control. It
Sure.
thinks, you know,
Yeah.
it thinks, you know,
Yeah.
your conscious, that consciousness is for me and my pleasure, but that's not it. Actually, I'm here to support that.
Right. I'm laughing thinking about myself trying to tell myself who's writing who.
Exactly, who's riding who here.
That's great.
So
I'm
yeah,
aware.
discipline is important, but it's not the end all and be all. And I think we all have to listen to the natural rhythms of our own spiritual life and know when and where we need to be more disciplined and when and where we need to be more free.
Mm, I'm aware of the time. You also just made me painfully aware of this 20-year black box that if you're willing should be the basis of our next conversation. Because
Absolutely.
that sounds fascinating. But you also have 40 books, and I love to read. I'm reading Jeff Kripal's The Secret Body right now. Secret
Oh,
Body.
fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. Because he sort of introduced it as an outline of his work, and I thought that would be fascinating. Because he too similarly poses this really difficult question of there's so much to ask. You you really just start inching in.
Mhm.
Um, is there a book that you would point me to that you've written that, based on our conversation, you think I would be interested in? I'm also fascinated in the, not to steer your answer, but just to maybe underline some things. I one of my first interviews was actually with Elaine Pagels, a scholar of Gnosticism, and she
Yeah.
really got me hooked on this whole thing, actually.
I saw her last year, I think.
Oh, really?
She gave a lecture at the library in Philadelphia near where I live.
Oh, where are you in Philadelphia?
I'm actually now outside of Philadelphia, across the bridge in New Jersey, but I was in Center City until up until 4 months ago.
Oh my gosh. I'm in South Philly right now.
Oh, there you go. So we're gonna have to hang out sometime.
Yeah, are you where in South? I grew up in Haddonfield.
So, okay. So we're across the bridge, just beyond Cherry Hill in New
Okay.
Jersey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow.
Uh, my
Awesome.
wife and I. Yeah, we moved out of the city about 4 months ago.
Okay. Yeah. I Can you give me a recommendation for a book, and then I'll cut the recording and
I'm gonna
offline
give
we
you
can talk.
two.
Please.
Uh, The Path of Spiritual Breakthrough,
Okay.
which is I wrote about a year ago. Which will give you a lot of insight into my process and the experiences I've had that have influenced me. The other one is called The Soul's Journey to Wholeness, but it won't be published until about 2 months from now. It's
Mm,
written, but it's not quite published. But I feel like that one is opening up into the domain where my teaching is going currently.
cool. Awesome. I love the introduction. Jeff,
Fantastic.
where can people find you?
The best place is to go to my website, jeffcarreira.com.
Awesome. And I will include that in the bio.
Well, thank you so much.
Awesome. I'm gonna cut the recording if you don't mind hanging out for a second.
Yeah, go for it.